Hi guys, so I'm going to be starting out today just by copying up a couple of notes I made. One is on society as a concept network, which is an idea of was is, and the second one is called microeconomics of the concept network. And so I'll just show you the notes there. And I think what I'm going to do is just get straight into copying these up and allow future me, with the benefit of hindsight, to sort of explain actually what it is I'm doing. So I'm just going to get straight into it.
Alright guys, so in my opinion today's session didn't go very well. I was basically just trying to riff on was it society as a concept network idea. I first came across this idea when I was interviewing Andy Matushak maybe 4 months ago with Zander, and the final question we asked to him was one that had been submitted by Was, and it was about his new idea of society as a concept network, and I'll just play that section from the interview to you now, and you can check out the whole interview if you're interested. I'll put a link in the description, and I'll also include some show notes.
We saved the best till last. It's about a new. It is a bit of a wacky one.
Great.
It's about a new idea he'd been working on. He'd been discussing it with friends, and I guess I'll just quote literally what he said.
Sure.
I just spoke with friends about converting the whole operation of humanity into a huge concept network. People would operate as neurons, define their needs, define their interests, and define their capacities. They will organize into an efficient network of cooperation and knowledge exchange. We need software infrastructure to implement it. What do you think, Andy?
Cool, yeah.
So it's a pretty interesting question, as you can imagine, and Andy did a very good job of coming up with a bunch of associations related to that quite wacky question that Was had asked. So specifically what I was interested in exploring in this session was thinking about how do ideas sort of propagate between the different nodes in the network, how do the nodes interact, what governs their interaction, and there were a bunch of links I felt I could make between microeconomics and this society as a concept network idea. I sort of felt that there must be some sort of underlying framework guiding the interactions of the nodes, guiding their decisions to allocate attention to different ideas, or whether to substitute their own ideas for other ideas, and so on. Another of my goals in exploring this question was to see if I could justify my belief that creative output ought to be the goal of learning without tying it to market economy or capitalism. And by that I mean that it's quite easy to justify the need to create creative output when you live in a market economy, because you have to create output in order to make money and satisfy your basic needs like food, shelter, and so on. I wanted to explore a sort of inkling I have about creative output sort of being a more fundamental economic system independent requirement of a learner, if that makes sense. And this is related to some of the ideas that I was talking about in my last incremental reading commentary, where I talked about knowledge valuation. I think that it's not sufficient to have pleasure as the goal of learning. I think there needs to be a meaningful goal, and I'd like to define meaningful goal as creating creative output and putting it into the real world. And the reason for that is that when you only use pleasure as the guide behind a learner's learning, it sort of leaves open the ability for anyone to justify any sort of absurd learning activity just by saying, oh well, I derive pleasure from doing that. And to make it more concrete, you see a lot of people, for example, in the spaced repetition community, they will cram things like trivia for pub quizzes, or just learn every country in the world, or things like that. And if your philosophy of learning sort of just has pleasure as the guide, then people can justify those sorts of things that seem absurd just simply by saying that they are pleasurable to do. So I wanted a sort of better overarching goal for learning. That's really the motivation behind this, I suppose.
I was pretty nervous about asking this question because I had no idea. If I was the interviewee in this situation, I would have had no idea how to respond to this question. But Andy actually did a very, very good job of coming up with a bunch of associations related to the concept network idea, society's concept network. He mentioned, for example, the collective and networked intelligence literature. He mentioned operations research and a bunch of other stuff, and I was really impressed by his answer. And actually, if you look in the description, I put a link to the original interview and also a link to some show notes, which contain basically bullet points. What did Andy respond? What did Andy say in response to the questions, and also some further reading if you're really interested. So my understanding of the society as a concept network is pretty much literally based just on this, and already I can sort of tell that my interpretation is diverging pretty significantly from what I think it is hinting at. But I suppose that's to be expected when you just read one sentence or a couple of sentences in a question and then try and create something out of it. But here's how I have started to interpret it. So you have a society, and in the society, the society is arranged like a network. So each node in the network is like a person, and there are interactions between the nodes in the network. And I decided to define the interactions as they're sort of decisions to allocate a scarce resource that the node has. So each person has a limited amount of either time or attention. I guess you can define it how you want. And they have to decide on the basis of something, where should I direct my time and attention? And what drives their decisions to pick something to direct their attention to over something else would be primarily be the surrounding framework or prevailing dogma of this concept network or society, which itself is decided based on the interactions between the nodes. So still very abstract and probably doesn't make a lot of sense. Doesn't even really make a lot of sense to me, but I will push through and continue to add the rest of the stuff on these notes. I've got through about half of the first one at this point, and I'm hoping future me can make this a little bit less obscure and opaque. But we'll see.
Well, unfortunately, future me is still kind of confused, so just keep going, buddy.
Oh, one other thing I'll do is I'll start splitting these things up into their own topics. So maybe I could have a topic for node, a topic for scarce resource, and just in that topic just focus on that one thing, and then maybe have other topics that try to talk about the different components of this idea in relation to each other. So yeah, that's what I'll do now. I'll just start pulling everything out into its own topic.
I found this is really useful in incremental writing. You take what you're going to write and you split it up into its component parts, and then you can actually reuse those parts in future articles, or you can turn them into their own article if they grow large enough. And it's just basically a really useful way to write in sort of a modular way.
Oh man, okay, so we've got a really wacky programming analogy here that I'll write out and then try and explain.
So I think that when you are working on something that you don't understand very well, it is very useful to create multiple sort of representations of the problem using domains that you're familiar with. So here I was attempting to express the ideas that I was having using code. And you saw me earlier using Paint, of course. Paint is an excellent tool for thought, tool for expressing poorly understood ideas. But yeah, I'm not sure actually how useful this was in the end.
Okay, I'm going to try and explain actually what I'm doing now, what my idea is of the node in the society as a concept network thing. So each node has a few abilities, you can think of them as, or behaviors, I suppose, right? Each node in the network can assess the value of something created by another node. Maybe that returns, like, let's just say it returns true or false, whether the thing is worth them investing attention into it. So imagine the node, it sees some object created by some other node in the society. It calls assess value on that object, and on the basis of whether it's true or false, it can decide to allocate its scarce resource attention to that object. And it also has one other ability, which is to publish its own output. So I sort of see the allocate attention thing as an input process into the node, right? And then the node, you know, does some thinking or whatever, and it starts to create its own output back into the society, which is probably going to be influenced by the, you know, everything it's been allocating its attention to, right? And, oh yeah, the final part is it assesses value based on some value function, right? And the value function is substitutable. So I think I'll move on to the concrete example and try to explain a little bit more actually what I mean.
This is just another example of trying to generate multiple representations to generate ideas about a problem you're trying to solve.
So here's my concrete example of a node, and the node is called a capitalist node, and its value function is a capitalist value function. So it assesses value, and when it assesses value, it asks the question, will allocating my attention to this object, let's say, allow me to produce more output per unit of input? That's just like, I don't know, the only, it's just my basic one sentence explanation of what a capitalist value function would be. I didn't put too much thought into that. Just go with it. And if it does, if the answer to that question after doing some calculations is yes, then it returns true, else it returns false. And then it decides to allocate its attention to whatever object that was on the basis of the output of that assess value function, right? And then I decided, okay, so in this society as a concept network idea, the prevailing dogma is sort of defined by a large proportion, or possibly the majority of the nodes accepting this value function and exercising the assess value function and making decisions consistent with it. And that creates the prevailing dogma, or just the prevailing value function of society or whatever. Okay. I'm going to move on to the microeconomics of the concept network, which is the second note. I don't feel like it's going that well so far. It's not really very clear to me where this is going at all, honestly. But I'm going to push through anyway. See if I can turn things around, make it a little bit more concrete. If not, what I'll do is I'll actually see if Woz has written anything on to Memoguru about this idea. Maybe I can start reorienting myself. Anyway.
When you're confused or stuck, I think it's important when you're using SM not to just sit still and do nothing. There are a billion things you can do in SM to push through a problem or push through a part of a problem that you're stuck on and to start moving in another direction. SM is really like an idea generation machine in a lot of ways. And I think I made a real mistake by not doing something like a subset review or just doing a search and review, or even a neural review, for example, of network science, graph theory. I could have done microeconomics or just anything. Instead, I sort of let everything just stop, you know?
Okay, I'm going to take a break and try and do some more thinking before I actually do any more of this writing. Alright, I'll be back in like 10 to 15 minutes. Alright, so I'm back. One thing I'm realizing is that SM is very good, or perhaps not even SM, just writing down ideas that you think are good. It's good practice because sometimes you realize that they aren't very good or they aren't very well understood. Like you don't understand your own ideas. So
Watching the recording back, I actually disagree with my former self, and I think the idea is perfectly workable. And I think that I started to get tired and confused simply just because I let my train of thought sort of sit still, rather than providing some sort of stimulus and sending it in another direction, in the form of a subset review or a neural review. So I think that was the real problem.
So guys, that's going to be it for today. Sorry this was so incoherent. Hopefully I can make another follow-up video in the future where I can explain it better. But also hopefully it was interesting just to see someone struggle with an idea rather than it just be me, already having pre-formulated everything and understanding it perfectly. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed it anyway, and I'll see you in the next video.